I'm Suzanne LeBrand, and this is Disobedient Femmes. Today, my guest is art historian and author Susie Hodge. Ms. Hodge has published more than 100 books about art history and artistic techniques, including Why Your 5-Year-Old Could Not Have Done That, The Short Story of Women Artists, and most recently, Artquake, the Most Disruptive Works in Modern Art. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I'm wondering if you could talk about how you got started writing books about art history that really do a lot to explain key movements, breakthroughs, themes, that would be the kind of thing that somebody might take with them into a museum to help them understand what they're looking at. Is that a fair assessment of...
That's a very good assessment, yes. Yeah, no, that's how I love to do that. I've always loved art. And I remember at school doing art history A-level and thinking, this is so fascinating. It's a bit like Shakespeare, you know, the more you look, the more you see and the more you study. I love those artists who you look in deeper and deeper and you always find something more. I love to educate. I did teach for a while, but the big thing with me, with one book I wrote in particular, How to Survive Modern Art, that they did for the Tate Gallery in London, was it's because I went to Tate Modern when it first opened, and it was fascinating to go around, look at the artworks, but more than that, hear what people were saying. Some people were laughing, some people were sniggering, some people were getting cross and being quite shocked by it. Other people were studying it and discussing it in great eloquent phrases. It was just fascinating the way everyone responded to it. So ever since then, I've just loved to be able to explain, because I know a lot of people, especially modern art, a lot of people get quite frustrated and they think that they're having a laugh at our expense. These artists are not really artists. It's Emperor's New Clothes. Well, maybe some of it is, but I think a lot of it really isn't. It all comes from a good place. I always have a person in mind when I'm writing a book who's the typical reader. And I think I'm walking with them, next to them in this gallery or wherever the work of art is. And I'm speaking to them. So it's quite polite. I wouldn't be rude. And I'm certainly not talking down to anyone because I don't know a lot of things in the world. And just because I know a bit about art doesn't make me any cleverer than anyone else. So it's really just having a chat with a person I'm with. It could be a friend, it could be someone I've never met before, but I usually have that person in mind. Even if I'm writing for children, if I'm writing for children, it's usually a group of them. They're all asking me questions. I'm thinking, how will I answer that? Because you have to be as honest as you can and as unpompous as possible.
You are also an artist yourself, and it's interesting that in addition to books about art history, you also publish books about artistic techniques and 3 books about how to draw. Is that right?
Over the pandemic, over last year, yeah.
What do you think having knowledge about the process of making art adds to our understanding about the nature of art itself? It strikes me that a lot of histories are told from the point of view of critics, not the point of view of makers.
I agree. I do agree. And I really think I find it particularly fascinating. I'm not sure that other people do, to look at the technique and to see how it was done. For example, we're going right back to, say, Van Eyck. Okay, he didn't invent oil painting. It was already invented. But what he did do was to develop a technique of using thin layers. If you think of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Ghent altarpiece or the Arnolfini portrait. They're perfect little jewel bright painting. Well, the Ghent altarpiece is quite big, but jewel bright paintings, and incredibly detailed, especially in comparison to art that was being produced in Italy at the time. For example, that was tempera, which was a completely different technique because it was pigment mixed with egg, whereas oil paint is powdered pigment mixed with oil. So I'm just fascinated. I am always fascinated by technique, and I love to really go up close in galleries, or as close as you're allowed to go, galleries and museums to see how the paint's been put on. Has it been used with their fingers, for example? Not necessarily just paint. I like paint because I paint, but I love to see all of it. Even all the installations using new technologies. I love all that as well. I think, how was that done? There's a wonderful artist who I went to see. I'm trying to think of her name because that's gone now. But she produced a wonderful work of art. I saw it in Spain, and it was of flowers that decayed. And her name will come to me after we've had this chat. But it was wonderful to see how she put it together and thought about it. Just any materials. I'm fascinated by matter and the world, I suppose.
Does that give you more fuel as an artist as well as an art historian to know how things are made?
Well, I hope so. Yes, I hope they are. I hope the fact that, for example, when I was still a student and I went to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris and saw how Monet had painted snow and all the colours he'd put in snow, and there was no black in this particular painting, the Magpie. And I went back and always used that, never used black, for example. That was a phase. And I went to an exhibition of Pissarro's as well when I was a teenager and watched the way he used brushwork. It was sort of angled. In fact, I think the curators had described it as three-dimensional brushwork. It wasn't quite off the canvas, but yes. So and then I went and practiced that. So yes, I do think it helps. I think it's really a good. If you're interested in art, I'm sure you'd have to be interested in the way things are made, I suppose.
What makes an art work disruptive, in your opinion?
Well, I think in the moment, a lot of artworks are disruptive. I think that's part of an artist's aim. Most artists' aim is to be original, to break the mold, to do something that gets them noticed. It's not that they're just attracting attention for no reason. Most artists are looking at the world, their particular world, at a current time, and doing something that's slightly provocative. It might be more than slightly provocative. It might not seem provocative at the time. It might not seem provocative to them at all. Manet, for example, in 1863, painted Olympia, and he based it on a painting by Titian. So he really thought and felt that he was heading for the great salon of Paris, and he couldn't really, although he knew he was being more contemporary, he couldn't really see why people didn't see what he was doing. And it's really that mindset, I think, that makes an artist. They think in a different way to most of us. They think in a more unique way. They think round a problem. I know we've got all these silly phrases like blue sky thinking and thinking out of the box, but really that's what they do. That's their job, is to think of something and turn it on their heads. So at the time, we might look back at, for example, that Manet painting and think, well, what was all the fuss about? And then we'll see something today and be quite shocked by it. So it's very often provocative in its era rather than later on. There's plenty of art produced by amazing artists that is very gentle on the eye. And I know a lot of us, and most of us, love to see beautiful things. We don't always want to be roused and riled and made to feel uncomfortable. But there's nothing to say that art had to be beautiful. I know the Greeks thought that, but art is anything. Andy Warhol said that art is anything the artist wants it to be. So yes, there is art that soothes, but similarly, it doesn't grab the headlines. It's the same as bad news. Bad news sells better than good news.
What would you say today pushes the envelope in the art world?
I think it's always women are often coming back. Now we've got a lot more women in the art world than we had before, and a lot of women aren't afraid. They look at the past and they see how many men painted naked women. It was all a bit voluptuous and it was all a bit salacious. And they're now saying, well, look at us. So, for example, they might paint blood or not just paint blood. They might produce some blood and smear it on the walls or something. They might show their bodies in a way that is not provocative, purposefully, trying to shock on purpose. They are deliberately trying to shock, to make people look at this and think, well, this is the beauty of art. This is art that makes us think. I'm thinking of Jenny Saville with her beautiful painterly big fat ladies that she paints, but she often scrawls some rather discomforting words on them, or she'll make the actual figure look uncomfortable. And we're going back to the way the female is portrayed. She's using all these wonderful ideas that artists use for centuries, beautiful application of paint, wonderful colours, but it's still a little bit uncomfortable. So really, art is so many different things. Tracy Emin produced Everyone I've Ever Slept With. And that was quite shocking at the time, because we read it, the general public read it differently. Think, what do you mean that tent is full of all these names? But of course, it was her mother, it was her little cousin, it was her friends. It wasn't as shocking as it seemed. So very often these things, when you dig under the surface, they're not quite as shocking as at first they might seem.
Is there a difference between art that we would see in galleries and commercial art or popular art? Does that distinction still hold in this day, would you say?
I think it does. I think Andy Warhol did a lot, and singularly, I know there were other artists, but Andy Warhol's the main one who changed that. I worked in the advertising industry, so I know about how commercial art is made, and it's really sweated over to make every single line look exactly precise and capture the eye within a few seconds, whereas fine art is less about that. It's more about pondering. It's about looking at it, walking around it, coming up close, stepping back, walking away and thinking about it over a day or so.
I'm wondering how you find new information about art and artists and where that information comes from.
That's a wonderful question, because history changes. For example, I was only writing a book today, but it wasn't today I discovered it was earlier in the week. I picked an artist in particular, a painting, very well-known artist. I can't say anything yet because the book's not quite finished. And from the time I'd chosen to use his work in the book too, which was about 3 or 4 months ago, to the time I started to write about it, I checked with the gallery where the painting is held, and they've done some research on it and discovered that they don't think it was by him anyway. And that can happen all the time. So a lot of it comes from the galleries. It's mainly the galleries, because they have the scientific, the technical expertise to look into these things. And there are people all over the world who are experts on certain artists. So they're called in and they'll look closer at something, or somebody might say, well, a private individual might say, I've got a Rembrandt on my wall. The experts come in, they do lots of tests and they discover whether it is or it isn't. But things do change, you're right. And I just have to keep up with it in lots of different ways. I always say, for every one fact I write in a book, and I know this sounds far-fetched, a lot of people stare at me, gawp at me, think, are you sure? I check every fact at least 4 times from different resources, because you just, especially writing books, you cannot afford to make mistakes. I mean, I'm sure I must do, but hopefully I keep up to date as at the time of writing. So I'll check the internet, but certainly not relying on that. I will check with galleries and museums and experts and hopefully get my facts in that way. I mean, even the Mona Lisa, there's new things coming out all the time about her. I mean, they still question why she has no eyebrows. Was it because she was over cleaned once, or was it how she was originally painted, and that sort of thing? Why did Leonardo paint the background, one side's lower than the other? All those things.
One thing I really appreciate about your books, looking right now at the short story of women artists, is that you do a really great job of giving the context and a little bit about the story of the artist or the time that it happened. And a lot of that was not part of the initial documentation. And, and of course, I think of somebody like Hilma af Klint, whose work was not generally known in the art world during her lifetime. Yeah. How is it that you go and find this information that may not be in any art history book?
I don't just use books. I suppose I'm like a dog with a bone. When I get interested, you know what it's like. And she is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. How she said that her work couldn't be published. She must have been quite a secretive sort of person, a bit Jane Austen-ish, really, even though she was later, much later. She knew she was onto something, but not for the bigger world. It wasn't intended for the wider world. So I suppose I go to as many exhibitions as possible, because you know that curators will always go the extra mile to find out information about these people. I get to exhibitions, I go into archives wherever I can, and I email a lot. Well, it's been during the pandemic, I email. Before the pandemic, sometimes I travel and go to these actual places to speak face to face with people and just generally find out connections and links, and as much as I can. I just think I want to know, so I'm sure other people do.
How has art functioned in this time period, in your opinion?
I suppose it's the same as all of us. What would we have done without the internet? I mean, I think in many ways, a lot of art has had a wonderful reception because it's been so global. And I think because galleries have been closed, galleries have thought of new ways of producing art and getting the public to see it. A bit like not just art, for example, the opera houses, and they've screened things. And I think it's been really quite wonderful for us, because I can't imagine how we'd have coped if we didn't have it. But it would be interesting to see how it changes from now on, because yes, there's some art out there now that's become really well known and sold for a lot of money that perhaps wouldn't have done if the galleries had been opened and social media wasn't around. So it is quite interesting. I suppose it's the same as offices. Will offices come back? I'm not sure about the whole world, but a lot of offices won't open again, will they? Now people are working more from home and discovered it's quite cost effective. I wonder if it will be the same with art. There'll be more online and not so much just in galleries.
Just in your experience in the last year, what were some of the ways in which art entered life in a new way that it might not have been able to, that people might not have been able to see it prior to the pandemic?
Well, there's social media. I mean, for example, Instagram is just huge. And you think of that, I really still don't know quite how people become what they call influencers, but it's word of mouth. People say, look at this, and it's become quite incredible. I mean, I love to go on and somebody might follow me, or I might get a recommendation. I'm useless on social media, by the way. I am on it, and I love to see people and meet new people on there, but I'm not the best at promoting myself. But it's so lovely to see. And you look at something, well, that's interesting. I've not seen that before. And then you go deeper, or there might be a link to something else. And it's really opened up, as far as other things, that shops are closing all over the place, stores are disappearing. But in a lot of ways, it's made it so much more accessible. And I think it will change it. Maybe the people will have more of a say rather than the galleries. I mean, this is what sometimes happens in fashion, doesn't it? You have the trickle up or the trickle down. Fashion either used to always come from the couturiers, and then it would be copied for people on the streets. And then it changed in the 60s, whereas all the kids, or the cool kids, were walking around with the fashion, and the couturiers picked up with what they were doing. So I think art is changing like that now. Things always change in a big way, but war, pandemic, I think it has the effect that changes everything. But we adapt. The human race is amazing. We've adapted so far. We will carry on.
Why is it important for people to know more about art and art history, even if they are not themselves artists?
Oh, I think it's really important. Well, I would think that, wouldn't I? But I really do believe that art is so important in the world. And I can't bear it when education is cut, because they always seem to cut the arts. There are so many reasons. I'll just give you a few, because I'll probably forget some. I would say that it teaches about history. It teaches us about moments in time, because art is of that particular moment. It's kind of a mirror of its society. They've proved that it's brilliant for children, because children can either voice problems or thoughts that they might have when looking at a work of art or producing art. It's been proved that it's great in the workplace because they've done experiments. I say all these specialists and scientists and doctors have have had offices with no works of art on the walls and some with, and they've actually checked, and people have been more productive in office spaces with works of art around them. And I should know that because my first job was at Saatchi and Saatchi Advertising Agency, and in those days Charles Saatchi used to put his collection on the walls of the art gallery, and I think we were all very creative in those days. But what else? They've proved that art can raise our endorphins, our happy hormones, and cortisol and dopamine, which is all about calming stress. Actually, I'm writing a book at the moment about things like this. It's good for our brains. It's good for our mental health. I mean, I could go on all day. I really feel that art, even if you might think, I don't like art, I'm not interested in art, give it a go. Because I think most people, that everyone can see something in their works, in a work of art. And as I always say, so the artist has come from their point of view. We come from our point of view. So the artist has brought all their experiences and knowledge, and we bring ours. So we're always going to interpret things slightly differently. It's the same as a viewpoint. Even if you and I were standing next to each other, looking at a beautiful field or a garden, you would see it from a slightly different angle to me. And that's the beauty of art. So you can discuss it, so it can open up conversation. I could go on, as I say.
Today on Disobedient Femmes, I have been speaking with art historian, artist, and prolific author Susie Hodge, who has just published Artquake, the Most Disruptive Works in Modern Art. For listeners who are interested in learning more about your work and getting a hold of Artquake and many of the other wonderful books you've written, where can they go?
We can go online, obviously. Any good bookstore, they should have them in. Like museum, galleries, all those shops, they should be everywhere. If not, ask at the shops, please. I want them in the shops. I want people to read them and see how lovely art is, how wonderful it is, and uplifting it can be.
Well, thank you so much for being on Disobedient Femmes.
Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to chat.
I am Suzanne Legrand. Each week on Disobedient Femmes, I bring you interviews with amazing women, writers, artists, and activists who are reimagining the world. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and let us know what you think by leaving a comment. Thanks.